I think people very rarely think of themselves as bad people. And I do think most Americans will say that racism is bad and that misogyny, although that's a much more rarely used word than racism, they'll say they don't hate women as a class. And, and so to get back to the political correctness issue, I think, and I also don't think we should over extrapolate from like the most disgusting people on Twitter, whatever they're saying right now. But I suspect that most Trump supporters do not use the N word, and they would say. And what they would say is, about to get back to the political correctness thing is they would point out, look, the rules have gotten a lot tighter than that. It's no longer just don't say the N word, right? It's like a whole host of things you have to tiptoe around. And sometimes, honestly, they when I have to stop and think, I've said this before on this show, but when I was denouncing Trump for mocking and I said a handicapped person, and then I had to stop and think, wait, is handicap still the acceptable term? There is a lot of that you have to do, and a certain amount of mental energy has to go into it. So when these people perceive that the people who are imposing this speech code on them, some of which they think is gratuitous, are the enemy to begin with, they are these elites who don't like them, I think it all kind of interrelates this way. And even the term white supremacist, which you use, now white supremacist used to mean, something different. It meant people who said explicitly, whites are better, deserve better, and on and on and on. And the fact is, the term white supremacist is now used much more broadly than that. It's used to denounce people who never say things like that.
Yeah, and in the end, I'm not fundamentally concerned about speech codes myself. I'm concerned about systematic racism. I'm concerned about economic policies that disenfranchise some and enfranchise others. Just
right. But when they talk about political correctness, I think they largely mean speech codes, and they would point out that the speech codes are changing, and have changed, and they feel more constrained by them.
And when I'm talking about racism, I'm not just talking about the N-word. I'm talking about somebody who wants to bring back stop and frisk, regardless of the fact that it's been ruled unconstitutional. So
right, but even there, they would say, see, they don't think of themselves. I'm just saying they don't think of themselves as racist for favoring stop and frisk.
Yes, and I don't care that they don't think of themselves.
Right, but I'm just trying to. My whole job here apparently has become trying to present the way I think the world looks from their point of view, which I think isn't that a very Christian thing?
It is. And I do think that imagining ourselves in as credible and sympathetic a reading of those whom we oppose is a fundamental task. But and that's why I would talk about not how they see themselves, but the ways in which I think persons are vulnerable to manipulation. So I do think that if you sort of make people feel vulnerable, under threat, and you inundate them with a discourse that is calcifying, that is generating insensitivity in them. I'm talking about Fox News, the sort of right-wing talk show industry. These people have been mocking and huge chunks of American populace. They are profoundly soaked in the washed in misogyny. I mean, the sort of comments about Megyn Kelly and blood coming out of who knows where. This kind of discourse is totally normal in what a great section of the country is listening to.
Well, it's become that way. I mean, he has normalized a lot of stuff that wasn't normal.
Well, actually, I think that he's brought it to a certain.
I mean, it wasn't normal in these media venues. I wasn't hearing it.
That's correct. But I do think that if you turn on any particular episode of Rush Limbaugh, you'd hear a good bit of
some. Yeah, that's true.
So this is not new. It's merely coming out of the closet and giving itself great public visibility. And right-wing movements do seem to emerge in moments where people feel a certain kind of cultural onslaught. There is, in fact, a case to be made that economic factors do play a role in this. That incomes have been stagnant for decades now, and there is a cultural sense of cultural and economic sense of fragility. All of that is abroad, but I think those fundamental economic factors, those larger cultural and even ecological issues which imperil us all, the real fears that we ought to be talking about, are not the ones we're talking about. Right? So instead, our sense that something fundamentally is in fact awry, and believe me, there's plenty really awry. I mean, the fact that we're living in ecocidal peril is in fact a real and genuine apocalyptic fear that ought to be concerning us. But instead, we are being taught to fear certain groups and classes of people, and that, it seems to me, is morally problematic and spiritually toxic. And the generation of as I said, fear and anger, rather than the cultivation of sensibilities like empathy or love, that's what concerns me. And for a Christian theologian, a discourse of fear rather than faith is inimical to the heart of the tradition, right? Perfect love casts out fear. We're called to cultivate in ourselves a different set of moral dispositions, not these. And that's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things. I think one thing you suggested, I think, is true, is that the way for this has been paved to some extent for many years by things like Fox News, and it gets back to the fact that there are actual issues, economic issues, in the heartland that Republicans have systematically not addressed, and that's posed them with a political problem, which is how do you keep these people on board whose economic needs you're not particularly serving, and they've given them instead, to some extent, the social issues. We agree with you on abortion or gay rights or whatever, but also they've cultivated antipathy toward these supposed cultural elites. It's like a let them eat hate kind of strategy, and I think, and see, that's why, in the end, the people, I don't think that's all that's going on by any means. I think it's one thing that's going on. And the people that I find most reprehensible, the thing I find most reprehensible about Trump is that I don't know that he's a racist or anything else. What I feel sure of is that he so wants attention that he would do anything to get it, including appeal to the worst parts of human nature. And that's the dangerous thing about him. If he had racism would at least be a conviction. He'd have a principle. It wouldn't be a good one. But in a way, I think the most dangerous kind of person is a person like him who will appeal to any part of human nature in order to aggrandize his own stature, power, and just hang on to attention. So I guess that's a little bit of a sermon, but
and it also names something that a phrase that I found completely helpful to me in a variety of contexts, which I think is Stanley Tambia, the Harvard anthropologist, phrase: majority with a minority complex. Right? Make people who are in fact numerically the majority feel like they are in fact somehow the minority, and make them feel aggrieved against actual minorities and persons who are in fact structurally vulnerable. So the anti-homophobic comments, the anti-immigrant comments, right? These are dedicated and directed at actual minorities whose positions are marked by precarity. And Instead, we generate another set of sentiments in which white majorities are made to feel like they are the aggrieved and wounded. When that discourse is set in motion, then that population can be mobilized in directions that are, in fact, actually self-harming. So, and this, of course, was precisely the kind of thing that the King's Poor People campaign was meant to avert, right? To bring and create a sort of multiracial poor people's campaign in order to address fundamental structural inequities that bear upon white working class voters, which are in fact in raw numbers far greater than the African American poor, right? In terms of just sheer raw numbers, right? So there's a sense in which there's an affect machine that has been at work over now decades on the right wing to generate this sort of majority with a minority complex. And those affects have very little to do with the fundamental orientations that Christians are supposed to cultivate in themselves. And that's the theological problem. What are we being taught to hate? What are we being taught to love? I think if we ask those questions, we get pretty close to theological very fast. Are we being taught to love the other, the neighbor, the one who doesn't look like me, the one who doesn't think like me? Or am I being taught to be suspicious of and hate and close the door to the other? That's a set of theological questions.